Welcome to Grit, Real Stories of Recovery. My name is Paul, and I'll be your host. Please note that this podcast is uncensored and may contain material that is not suitable for all audiences. I'd like to welcome today Brandon Bishop. Brandon, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today and share your story of recovery.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be able to talk about my recovery. So I appreciate you asking. Thank you.
Well, great. Thanks. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your upbringing, your life as a kid, your home, school, that sort of thing that led up to the beginning of your first experimentation with drugs or alcohol.
Well, I'm born and raised here in Colorado. Grew up in a loving family, a religious family. My grandfather was a pastor. My father also was a pastor. But the funny part is I'm gay. So I always say God has a sense of humor.
So let me ask you, did you know you were gay from a very young age? Or maybe what age?
No, I didn't. It wasn't until I was probably closer to 18, 19, 20 that I realized I had an attraction to men. Before that, I just felt different. I didn't know what or why, but I just wasn't interested in the same things as far as like dating women and stuff like that, the people closest to me were, or that I was supposed to be doing, as a young person. It just didn't quite click that way for me, But again, like back when, as a young person, especially as a kid, I didn't know that is why I felt different. I think growing up in a church community, you have loving people around you a lot. And so that was really nice, growing up with community, growing up with family. But there's the part of that is as well is I think there's a lot of messaging that happens in religion there's a lot of shame and guilt and expectations of how one is supposed to be. And, that for a young person is hard. Because I was always trying to like live up to this standard that was unachievable and unattainable for, I think, most any human being. And so I remember at a certain point, you're called like bad enough. You're being a bad kid, you're being a bad whatever. I was still getting the attention, so I was just like, well, fine, I'll just get the attention for being bad then.
Sure.
It was like, that's who I am. That's who you've told me I'm going to be. Well, I'll show you. And so that's when, relationships with specifically my dad started getting harder, him being a pastor and me.
How old were you at that time?
I would say teens, and again, kind of normal teenage behavior, right, as well as pushing back against authority and testing boundaries. And so, it just started the relationship between my dad and I started getting harder. And I think in that I started acting out more as well, and seeking ways to be able to act out also.
Right. But by and large, you would say you had and I hate to use this word, quote unquote, normal, loving home environment. There wasn't any abuse or violence or drinking and using in the home that propagated your drug use?
No, I will say growing with some like spiritual understanding. I was spanked as a kid. I think corporal punishment was acceptable in that day and age.
Yep, that was my experience.
Yeah. However, I've come to see that as a kind of abuse. I think hitting anybody is harmful to them. And so I can see how that caused damage. Even though my parents at the time, I would say they believed they were doing it out of love. That still had an effect on me. I will also say growing up in a religious family as a gay person has, some people would name that like religious trauma. And so that also like played a part in me needing to feel differently than I felt. The pain, the shame, the anger, guilt that I felt, at a certain point, I just needed to not feel those things.
Right, or feel differently. So, when was the first time you started using, and why do you think that was?
I think it's pretty typical for, at least for kids around where I grew up in Parker. It was actually like, I call Audrey my second mom. She was like my mom's best friend growing up. She allowed us to drink one night. She wanted us to kind of like have the experience, but in a safe space. And in a lot of ways, like I appreciated that, because like, let's be honest, kids are going to drink and do drugs for the most part, not everybody, but I was going to experiment either way. So Audrey let us drink one night. And
So, was this something you had planned? Because my experience was there was just something when I was 13 years old that made me want to experiment with, right, something that was mind altering, to feel different. And I don't know what that was that made me do that. I've come to learn later that it was the disease of addiction. But was this something you had ramped up to and planned, or did you just show up there and everybody was like, hey, we're going to drink tonight?
hard to remember the specifics, but I do remember as a young person, like always being very intrigued by substances. I was never one that was afraid of alcohol and drugs. I wanted to try any and all of them as quickly as possible. And so to have the opportunity presented in like a quote unquote safe space, I was all for it for sure. And there was no like hesitation. And so I think the biggest thing that jumps out at me from that experience was that we were all drinking, right? There was me, my sister, Curtis, and Andrea, my closest friends growing up, and then Audrey.
And how old were you?
Around 16. They all had a beer. However, like I took a shot of Southern Comfort, and I kept going back and getting more and more and more. And they all just had their beer. And so I never understood what was happening there, but that was like my addict being switched on. And there was no like, should I or shouldn't I? It was like I was powerless. I couldn't help but go back.
Right. There was no question.
There never was with my drinking or drugging. No.
So what did you feel like? What was that like? How did you feel? What did you do? What was your experience?
I just remember like it took all cares away. I didn't necessarily feel a lot. It was more that I didn't feel. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel guilt. It was kind of more of like a carefree, but also in a way of like, I don't care about anything.
Right.
So that was, that's
So like this sense of freedom.
freedom. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. Just, yeah, carefree freedom. And there is some like euphoria in it all as well. I think that's why we drink, is because there is a euphoric feeling to it. And I wanted more. I wanted more euphoria.
So then what did your using look like for the next few years?
Well, so from there, it was not easy for me to get access to drugs or alcohol. So it was really sporadic. But in all that time, even though I wasn't necessarily drinking or drugging a lot, that was always like a focus. Like, how are we, me and my friends, going to get pot or alcohol? For me specifically, it was very important that that happened. And again, like, it wasn't really frequent, but it was a regular occurrence for me, specifically marijuana, because it was the easiest to get access to. And so it was kind of like whenever, however I could, I definitely was like seeking more of the drugs, the alcohol.
Right. Was there ever a period when and I'm assuming it's when you moved out of your parents' house, that your drinking and using was able to happen regularly, freely, and began ramping up?
Yes. So after I graduated from high school, I moved to New York City. I was going to school out there, and it's much easier to get your hands on alcohol in New York. And there was a bar that would let us in underage. And so we would go regularly there. And I remember like Long Island iced teas were $6, and they freehand poured them. So they were very strong. And I drank those because they had the most liquor in them. And I knew that they were the strongest drink. And so I would take enough money. However much money I took that night, that's how much money I was going to be spending on Long Island iced teas.
Right.
And again, like, it just got a lot easier to drink when I wanted to. It was also like, we were in college. A lot of people were doing that. So
It was normal.
it was normal. Like, that was just what you did on the weekends. Like, you went to the bar or smoked marijuana in your dorm with your friends, or at that time, some use of like ecstasy, stuff like that. More like club drugs came into the picture as well. But for me, it was always like alcohol was the easiest and the quickest to get me to the point to where I wanted to be, which
Right.
was that carefree, I don't have any feelings, euphoric feeling. Yeah.
Wow. And so then, did you do that throughout college? Did you graduate college? Did you start escalating during college? What did those years look like?
Yeah, so I did that throughout my first 2 years at FIT and ended up dropping most of my classes. That's the first time that I can remember alcohol having side effects other than just a hangover the day after. I started feeling more like disappointed and ashamed of my behavior at that time because of drinking so much that I couldn't attend class. And then that just kind of snowballed. So then I would skip class, but then I'd start lying to my friends and pretending that I had gone to class. But again, like, we would drink regularly, so that gave me the relief from any of that shame or guilt that I was feeling. And I wouldn't say it necessarily progressed because we were just doing it regularly, For me, whenever I drank to get drunk. There was no stopping point. So it was just more at that time, like pretty consistent. And because my friends were doing it as well, it was easy to chalk it up to being young and having fun.
Kind of validated and justified it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
What was one of the craziest things you did during that time?
Well, I don't know like how crazy it necessarily was. We were just, I hung out with a lot of pretty girls and we were allowed to get in wherever we wanted to go.
Skip the line.
Skip the line, go to the VIP. Right at that time, it was like the Yankees were winning all the World Series. They would go to this specific club. We would be able to get in. I got to see a lot of celebrities and stuff like that. So, like, I thought I was like the shit.
Right.
You know what I mean? I'm getting into like the best club in New York City. I'm hanging out in the VIP with whomever. And at that time, it just felt really like fun and exciting.
You kind of feel like you've made it.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
I'm at the top in New York City.
Exactly, which is like exactly, I didn't care about like necessarily being really successful. I wanted to like party with whomever. That was being more successful to me than like having a great job or, any of the other stuff. That didn't matter. I enjoyed partying more, and that's what I wanted to do more of.
Right. So when did it turn for you? Like when did the consequences, you described your consequence around school and how that made you feel. When did those consequences start becoming more frequent and worse in nature? And did your using escalate because of that? Or did you have the consequences because your using escalated? Did your using change?
Well, so along that point in time, I'm going to back up for a second and say, so I guess one of the craziest things that ever happened and a consequence of my drinking was when I came out to my parents. I was really nervous to tell them. And so I had come home from New York for a visit, knowing that I was going to come out to them. And I got really intoxicated and ended up wrecking my mom's car. And I was on the hospital bed because I had to get some stitches in my head, crying on a hospital bed, and just blurted out, "Mom, I'm gay."
Were you handcuffed to the hospital bed because of a DUI?
No, growing up in Parker, Colorado, and being a white person, they were pretty lenient on us, and I did not. I got like slaps on the wrist, time and time again, whether it be a DUI, whether it be, whatever happened. I again, because of my privilege of being a white person in Parker, Colorado, like I was not treated poorly by police officers, and I didn't get the severe consequences outside of just the normal. This is like what is standard for sentencing for a DUI or whatever other mischief. I was drinking in public.
Right.
Like public intoxication, like the many times that I was, arrested, given a ticket or whatever. But when I was back in New York City and out as gay.
Well, wait a minute. I want to back up to
Yeah.
how your mom reacted.
So when I told my mom I was gay, the only thing she said was, "I know." And I was able to calm down and stop crying because it was finally out. And then she asked me if that's why I had been drinking. And I said yes.
Of course you were going to use that.
Yeah, looking back at it now. And honestly, at this point, like I I hadn't recognized there was a problem yet. So my drinking was still, in my mind, just normal young people behavior. You know, I was 23. My friends were still drinking like I thought my friends were drinking like I was drinking. And it was true. Like I drank because I was nervous to come out. But I also, like, there are other reasons I drank. And then I went home and told my dad, and, you know, he was just said, all I know is you're my son and I love you. So
That must have been difficult, huh?
yeah, it was really like, I don't think most people understand the fear of telling your family something like that, specifically when there are many kids, even still today, whose families disown them, who kick them out of the house, who, you know, if nothing else, accept them begrudgingly, not wholly as who they are,
Did you feel like your parents accepted you wholly?
as best they could.
Okay.
I think it takes time. It's taken this long for me to accept myself wholly as a person now. And so in the beginning, I will say there was acceptance, but there was not understanding.
Right. So did you feel at that time like you kind of got away with your drunk driving thing because you had been able to drop this big bomb on them?
Totally. Yeah. It was all like a great cover, right? Like, I don't even think, honestly, I was charged with anything by the police. So it's like a funny story, right?
Right, because you totally got away with it.
I totally got away with it. And
So then what did it look like after that, right? Did you just pick back up where you left off?
oh, absolutely. Yeah. So went back to New York City because I was just home on a visit. And, you know, at this time, because I had come out, also I had like come out to myself pretty much before then, I was going out even more so, you know, several nights a week, 3, 4, 5. I mean, I'm sure there were weeks I went out every night of the week. And drinking and whatever else was on the table offered up. Like, sure, why not? You
Like
know?
what?
You know, at that time, I remember somebody giving me some meth, but it was in like a powder form, and so I thought it was cocaine. And marijuana, ecstasy, I'd say cocaine. Those were like the mainstays. There was always going to be alcohol, but whatever else was just kind of like icing on the cake. So
Sure.
whoever had whatever, yes, that was the answer. There was no questioning.
Right, I'm in.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So then did your using change because you now felt comfortable with yourself?
Well, I think that's the myth, is that because I'm out of the closet now, I'm comfortable with myself.
Right.
You know, it's just now people know. Now people know that I'm gay. And so at that time, at that age, still really early in my 20s, I was still exploring and figuring out who I was. And a big part of that, and a big part that I wanted to be of that, was the fun party, you know, going out, getting in wherever I want to, hanging out with whomever I want to.
And then telling the stories about it
And
after.
yes, exactly. Like, it's all fun and exciting, and like you're in the city and something new and fun happens every night. And so, yeah, at that time, it was still my drinking and using. I couldn't see any issues with it because I was having fun. It was a good time. I had friends. Yeah, it hadn't really gotten scary yet.
And when did it change, right? I think I'd asked you this a few minutes ago. When did it go from being fun to not being fun?
Well, that's when I started losing more jobs. And living in New York City is very expensive. And
Did you drop out of school?
yes, I had dropped out of school again for the second time and working mostly retail jobs. A lot of them I would leave just because I wasn't progressing in the company like I thought I should be. They didn't recognize my talents,
Of
you
course
know?
they did.
But then I started getting fired from jobs for drinking, whether that be on the job, whether that be coming into work hungover,
Missing work.
all of those things. Like that's when, I really started having more trouble because I was drinking and using more frequently, that I couldn't maintain a job, which then led me to not being able to maintain housing. And when you're living in New York City and you're housing insecurity, it's pretty scary. There's not a lot of options, or I didn't know of options out there for me. And so always having that instability in my life, it caused a lot of fear, because there was no stability. I couldn't rely on myself. I couldn't rely on work because I would, lose jobs, and then housing as well. Am I going to be able to make rent? Am I going to be able to, make it to work? All of those sorts of things. And they really started to wear on me. And that's when I decided it was probably time to leave New York City. And so I did a geographic. I had come home again to visit, and I never went back. I just left all of my stuff in New York City. By that point, I didn't have a lot.
Right.
I basically just had clothing. I had been living at somebody's house who just let me stay there rent free. And so I moved back to Denver, or to Parker, to have a safe space to live.
And you live with your parents at first?
Yes. Yeah. Back to the parents' basement, probably I was around 26 or 27 at this time. So yeah, I moved back home. Because I was living at home, I think I tempered my drinking some, because again, I didn't want my parents to see how much I was drinking. At this point in time, I also started getting sick, and I didn't know exactly what it was. I also didn't have health insurance. So it was I don't know what to do. And so I went to the doctor and ended up testing positive for HIV. And so
then let me ask you a question, and it'll back up kind of to your New York wild days. As a part of your drinking and using, were you having a lot of sex with different people, right? And just because you had very low inhibitions and you were drunk, or were you just so happy that you were out that you were experimenting, or some combination thereof?
Totally. I'm a combination. I think part of it is when you're drinking and using, I was so myopic, I could only see what was happening right in that moment. Mm-hmm. So there was no future thinking. It was, what do I want to do right now? Then when you're put in very sexually charged environments, in that state of mind, then that is what my brain went to, was sex. So yes, that led to having many sexual partners. I would be waking up in random apartments around New York City and having to ask what borough I was in and what train I could take to get back to Queens or wherever I was living in New York City at the time. And so part of that, I think, was seeking validation, like validation of who I am. Also, proving masculinity. Look, how many people want to have sex with me?
Right.
That must mean I'm more masculine, and then just normal. Also, like at that time, having a lot of hormones and craving sex, and so it was kind of like a perfect storm for being very promiscuous.
Right. So you go to the doctor, you find out you're HIV positive, and what happens?
Well, then I was put on medication. Luckily, by that point, HIV had become very manageable. It wasn't no longer a death sentence, but adjusting to the medication was really hard on my body. I ended up losing a ton of weight. I was about a little over 100 pounds, and I'm almost 6'2". So it took a long time for my body to get back to a place where I could even hold a job.
Did your drinking and using change during that time?
I wasn't doing any of that.
So you, in essence, had stopped.
Yeah. But it wasn't like because I wanted to, it was more, I was very sick. Like I was on death's door. A normal person has like 700 T cells. I had 36. And had I gotten the flu, I could have died at that time. It was, my health was that in that precarious a situation. So for me, like it was probably at least a 6-month process of getting to a place where I even had enough strength to do much of anything. So there wasn't a lot of drinking or drugging during that time. But as soon as I got a job and
And this is once you were healthy again.
yeah, once I was more healthy, was able to work again, my drinking picked right back up to where it was before.
Where you were drinking every day, going out with friends, maybe not the same club scene, but
Totally.
seeking that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There was, again, like I hadn't identified drinking being a problem yet or drinking and drugs being a problem yet. So anytime that I could drink, I would. Anytime that I could go out, I would. Yeah, there was no question.
And so then what did that look like as you kind of reintegrated to the world? Did your drinking progress? Did things start getting worse? Was there ever a point when you were like, I shouldn't be doing this?
It took a while still after becoming healthy again and starting to drink and drug. After I got healthy, I got a job and then was able to get an apartment on my own. Because while I was sick, I was staying with my parents. I had been living with my parents for probably 2 years. Then I got sick. And then when I was able to get healthy again, got a job, moved out. And I think within 6 months, I was being evicted from my apartment for not paying rent and it was all because I was spending all of my money on drugs and alcohol.
So it ramped up quickly.
Yeah, like once I was on my own and there was nobody watching me, It was
Right.
like, well, then why not drink whenever? And so that's when I started also like going to work drunk, or, that's when it really became like also planning how am I going to get the drugs and alcohol that I need, planning when the liquor store was closing. So that meant which train I had to take to get home by this time to still make it to the liquor store so that I can have enough booze to get through the night. And at that point, I was drinking a bottle of vodka to myself every night.
And so what were some of the consequences? You talked about losing your apartment. What were some of the other things that got you to that point where you said, or at least the first time you said, I need to stop?
I had some DUIs along the way, but I think the hardest part was losing jobs that I really cared about, that I actually wanted. And then, losing the apartment. I think at that time, like I had alienated a lot of my friends. So I was really lonely. It was a lot of like drinking at home alone. And that's when it was really interesting. Just like it finally hit me. Like I could see the addiction cycle and how my drinking led to me losing a job, led to me like losing housing, led to me, it was like, it's crazy. It happened over and over and over again, but it took me, till it took me to recognize the pattern.
Right? You finally started connecting the dots.
Yes, exactly.
So at that point, did you try to stop?
Yeah. I mean, and granted, there were bits of like trying to control my drinking before that. I was trying like every solution possible so that I didn't have to stop. But at that point, when I was being evicted from my apartment and really had no other options, that's when I was like, this is really a problem. If I don't stop this, this is going to keep happening. But also at the time, I didn't understand like how am I supposed to go to rehab? Like I can't afford like Passages Malibu or any of those.
Which is so funny that you think you're going to Passages.
Well,
right?
that you think you can afford any rehab. Not having a job, not having insurance, not having any stability in your life. Like how am I supposed to afford rehab? And I reached out because I knew I needed help. And I reached out to my friend who was a doctor, and he told me I should go to the emergency room and ask for a mental health check. And because I did that, then they started showing me like different programs that I could have access to where I could finally get some help with my alcoholism.
And so while you were there, what did that decision process look like? Were you finally ready to say, all right, I'm going to take action?
Yeah, because I didn't want to keep living life the way that I was. Like it was going nowhere.
Do you remember that moment of clarity? Was there a point in time that you could point to and say, that was it?
Yeah, I was in bed in the apartment that I was being evicted from, finally connected the dots of the cycle. And I was like, I'm done. Like, I can't. At this point, like, I was, waking up in terror every day. Like, how am I going to get enough booze? How am I going to get enough money to pay my rent? How am I going to, And so it was just like, I can't take this anymore. I can't keep living like this.
So you went to the hospital, you got a mental welfare check, and they referred you to some different options. And what did you do from there?
So I went to like a detox facility that I thought was free, but it didn't end up being that way. But the nurses helped me get a grant. After that, like I didn't have a place to live. So they gave me some resources of places to check out. And I didn't want to go back to my parents' house. Like I had done that enough times. Like it was finally time for me to like go like figure stuff out for myself kind of. And that's when I found out about Step 13, which is what it was called back then. And so I came to Step 13 and I got sober and I got a job that I enjoyed and life got better and, things started turning around and I was finally kind of more living up to my potential.
And what were the things that you were doing that made life get better?
So honestly, like at that time, I I didn't do anything outside of stay sober.
And how did you stay sober? I guess that's my question. Was
Sure.
it like force of will alone? Did you get
Totally.
engaged in 12-step programs?
At the time at STEP, there were meetings that we went to. I think that was the main thing, were meetings. But then when I went out and got an apartment of my own, I didn't stay connected to any of that stuff. And so eventually, like, the ideas came back. Like, I knew I didn't want to drink because I knew where drinking took me, but maybe let's try some other things.
Right. Because those weren't my problem.
Exactly. And so I started doing party drugs and, smoking marijuana pretty frequently, starting to go out to the clubs again and doing, GHB, ecstasy, meth, again, whatever anybody had, I would do.
But you didn't drink.
But I didn't drink. No. So I was okay, right? Because I'm not drinking. I'm okay. Nothing to see here. But yeah, it was, again, it was fun for a while again, because like I said, like I had, at that time, I had a job that I enjoyed doing. Getting sober had afforded me a few things, like the job, the apartment, stuff like that. Because I had a stable place like Step 13 at the time to rebuild my life, I was able to rebuild it to a point that, like, life was good. And that's when it was like, okay, let's try getting fucked up again. But that didn't last terribly long.
It never does.
No, it doesn't. And so I went from, going out just on weekends to going out in the middle of the week, smoking marijuana every day. But really where it ended up for me was using meth every day. I got fired from the job that I loved for being high on the job. My life started to everything that I had built up that I enjoyed was starting to crumble again. My relationships with my family were crumbling again. And that's when I started using needles. And, from then on, it's just like it goes downhill fast. Got to another breaking point. One night I was wandering the streets. It was like the first night that I wasn't going to be able to manipulate like someone's bed for the night, or, whatever else I could do to like scam a roof over my head for that night. Again, like, I was wandering the streets. I knew I didn't want to sleep on the street that night. And so I went to the mental health crisis center. They talked to me for a little bit, and then were like, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, what are my options? And they're like, well, you can go to a homeless shelter or you can go to detox. And all that time, like, I had kept planning on getting sober again because, like, life was real shitty once again. And I knew I could get sober because I had gotten sober.
Right.
So I was like, well, I guess we're going to detox. And from there is when, again, my life, like, your life gets dramatically better when you're not sticking needles in your arms every day. And that was also when, again, another moment of clarity. Like, I knew I could get sober, but I knew I had done some things wrong before. I promised myself that I was going to do everything I didn't do before.
And what did that look like?
So for me, that meant getting a sponsor and joining a 12-step fellowship and getting really involved in that. I found somebody who had what I wanted, and I asked that person to be my sponsor. And then they started meeting with me regularly to help me go through the steps.
And where were you living at the time? So you get out of detox, and where do you go?
Back to Step-Denver.
Of course you did.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm really grateful to have a place where, you can kind of put your life back together, and there's caring support around you to help you do that. But really, like, the work I had to do was my own work.
Right, the 12-step work. So talk
Yeah.
more about that. So you get into the work with a sponsor. What other things were you doing differently? You said, I'm going to do these things that I didn't do before.
At the time, what that looked like was finding meetings that I enjoyed going to, getting really involved with the meetings. I had a service position there. Like I said, I met with my sponsor, but also, with working the 12 steps, it's like you get to like fully admit what the effect that drugs and alcohol are having on you, and you like see it on paper what's going on. And through the 12 steps also, like, I got to really look at my resentments, my fears, my sex history, and the role that I played in everything. Because beforehand, it was always somebody else's problem.
Yep.
The world was out to get me, or there just wasn't a problem. It was like nothing to see here. So being able to like really see like, oh, I have a part in this. And because I can see I have a part in this, then there's a solution, because I have a way out. I can take action. And because of that, then I got to go to people that I've caused harm, people, institutions, and make things right, so that I don't have, what do they call that? All these skeletons in the closet waiting for me, waiting to destroy me.
Right.
Is what it felt like. I was running from all of these things that I had done, and to finally look at them, face them, and then go and, make them right. I didn't have all of these like fears and skeletons that I was running from anymore.
Right. So in doing that process, how did your life change, and what did it look like over that period?
Yeah. I was able to get jobs that I enjoy. I'm a hairstylist, and I was able to, build up a clientele and able to find housing. One of my favorite parts of all of this is I now live in the neighborhood that I was wandering the night that I got sober. The night that I went to the mental health crisis center. Like, I was wandering that alley, and now I live in a house on that street. And I've lived there coming up on 4 years now. And it's a place that I kind of the kind of place I always wanted to live, but never really believed that I would be able to live.
Right.
Because I couldn't afford or didn't have enough stability to do that.
Or just couldn't get your shit together
Couldn't-
to
yeah,
actually
exactly.
even make the effort.
Exactly. Some family relationships have come back.
And what does that look like?
Well, that's actually been a struggle recently, is like life happens, like we go through ups and downs with family. So there was a lot of repair that happened with me making amends to my family
Through the 12-step
through
process.
the 12 steps. Yeah. But I'm recognizing that, there was just a fissure that happened in the family, and I had to create space for myself so that I could heal some things within me, so that I can have a more healthy relationship with my family that's not so codependent. But again, because I have support, I have a program of recovery, like, I get to do those things, and I still get to show up in a way that is it within my integrity with my family.
In an authentic way.
Yes,
And
exactly.
is your family supportive of this process?
I think it's been hard for everybody. I don't think we saw this coming. We're just now starting to kind of mend some fences.
So it takes some time.
Yeah, but I think all in all, we all want what's best for each other, but sometimes that means separation is good for a while, so that again we can get back to a place where we have healthier connections.
Right. But it sounds like by and large, your life is so much different than it was. How do you feel about yourself and about the life you're living now?
Well, how I feel proud of the things that I've been able to accomplish. I feel good. The fact that like I show up to work on time, I do a really good job. That brings me pride and a sense of purpose. I also have the opportunity to do a lot of work in my community that's very meaningful. And I think just having like not having all of that shame, guilt, and fear weighing me down as much, it's kind of like that freedom that I was seeking through drugs and alcohol. Like I feel that through healthy behaviors.
That you actually found in recovery.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? That's just amazing. So even though your life is different now, even though you are working a program of recovery and rebuilt everything, and there's a part of you that intrinsically knows I can't use drugs and alcohol. Mm-hmm. Do you ever think about using drugs and alcohol?
Oh, for sure. I don't think that's ever not going to be a thing. For one, like, look at our world. I would venture to guess there's more bars in Denver than any other business.
I think that's the case everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. It's a part of the culture. And so that being said, the idea is going to come into my head, but the thought that follows it immediately is like, you know where that leads.
Right.
You know, like I've built up substantial evidence of how drugs and alcohol ruined my life. You know, I don't need any more proof. We're good there. Thank you.
Which is great. And it, you know, what it sounds like is you continue to work your program to keep that disease in remission so that when that thought pops up, you have coping mechanisms with which to deal with that.
Yeah, I think that's really important for me, is to stay connected to recovery, to a support system, staying connected to places that remind me of what happens when I drink and drug. We get to see regularly what the effects of drugs and alcohol in recovery, as well as new people come in and are getting sober.
Yep.
Which is a really good reminder of how bad it gets, because I forget.
And that it's waiting for us out there if we decide we want to go back.
Totally.
So what advice would you have for someone that may be suffering from their addiction, or a family member or friend that might be listening that has a loved one that's suffering from this disease?
I think for the person who's out there suffering, I would say ask for help. It's the hardest thing you'll ever have to do, but it's also the most rewarding thing you can do. And know that like life gets better and you can feel differently than you do now without drugs and alcohol. I'd say for the families, as hard as it sounds, is let them hit bottom. You know, the most loving thing you can do is take a step back and allow whatever needs to happen. And you can do that in a loving way. You know, I think that's part of loving yourself as well. And so the best thing you can do is to not, what's that term?
Enable
them. Yeah. Like let their addiction take them to a bottom, to a place where they have no choice but to get help.
Place where they become willing.
Yes.
That was exactly my experience with my family. As hard as it was for them, they just cut me off.
Yeah. Yeah. And same with mine. Like at a certain point, like it does become too hard on the family. And so to let the person who is the addict get to that point quicker,
Right.
because we do when we don't have help.
Yes, when there are no more resources, it gets bad quickly,
Yeah.
and we become very willing to do something
Yeah.
differently. You're right. Brandon, I can't say thank you enough for taking the time to be so transparent and honest and share your story with us. It's meant a lot to me, and I hope that it is meaningful to the folks that are listening. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, absolutely. Happy to do it. It's an honor.
This podcast is being brought to you by Step Denver Men's Residential Addiction Recovery Program. Step Denver gives men with nowhere else to turn the opportunity to overcome the consequences of addiction through a program based on sobriety, work, accountability, and community. For more information, visit stepdenver.org.